welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guests today are Gareth Higgins and Ari Weinzweig. I'll tell you about each of these gentlemen in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what's too often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment we exert toward others. And when you do it from a leadership perspective, as you will definitely discover that both Gareth and Ari are, you do it with a purpose of common cause, bringing people together for something they believe in. And belief will be a key theme of what we're going to explore today. So in brief, I'll tell you quickly about each of these gentlemen. Gareth Higgins is an author, originally from Northern Ireland, but also lives in the U.S. I saw Gareth speak at Zingerman's Roadhouse in late last year, and I was totally entranced by his work. He's a natural storyteller and writes about how to tell good stories. Ari Weinzweig is the co-founder of Zingerman's community of businesses. I've known Ari for more than 25 years, and I have found him to be inspirational. Not only is he an icon in the food business, he is also something of a philosopher, a prolific writer, and I read his work regularly. Gareth and Ari, welcome to Grace Under Pressure.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, John.
Both of you are great storytellers. And you do workshops together. Ari, you have a story of Zingerman's. Gareth, you have stories about what it was like to grow up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and you're very active in peacemaking activities there. So what can stories do for us that maybe other forms of communication cannot? You want to jump on that, Gareth?
Wow. Yeah, sure. Well, I think that storytelling is beyond breathing. It's the primary human activity. And our experience of reality is mediated through the stories we tell about it. We interpret everything that happens to us through the lens of a story. And we've been doing this all our lives from the earliest age. You know, we've been told things about what the meaning of our name is. Why am I called Gareth? Why are you called John? Why is Ari called Ari? What did our ancestors do? And often the story we've been told is who defeated who, or who mistreated who. And I grew up in a society that saw what you could call like the worst manifestation of what happens when you unconsciously accept a story of us versus them, and that is the worst manifestation is you end up killing each other. And if you start from the premise that your story is correct and you don't question your story, you might very well be likely to cause suffering to others, and certainly to yourself, unless the story you believe is that the evolution of humanity is one that's pointing toward more connection and not more separation, toward more shared and individual responsibility and not more selfishness and scapegoating, toward what I call community creativity and the common good. And if you don't ask yourself, what is the story I'm telling? You're never going to ask yourself, is it true? And you're never then going to ask, am I telling the most helpful version of it? And you may come to the conclusion that the story I'm telling is true but not helpful. So a true version would be, yeah, there has been conflict in Irish history, and there have been people who've done terrible things to other people. That is true. But what is the most helpful version of that story? And that's got to start with, what's my place in this conflict, and what can I do to make it better?
Well, Ari, I'm going to jump in, and you have been not only creating a story, but living a story for more than 40 years with the creation of the Zingerman's community of businesses, which began as a delicatessen. And you like to tell the story that you and your partner, business partner, Paul Saginaw, sat down and had a vision statement, which was not really all that common in the early 1980s. And while, of course, being in Ann Arbor is not like the adversarial as conditions in Northern Ireland, when you start a business and grow a business, there are a lot of people that say, no, you can't do this. So what has story meant to you, Ari?
Well, John, thank you. there were a lot of stories within that question. So when Paul and I started the deli in 1982, we're going to have our 42nd anniversary, 4 weeks. Kind of crazy. It was just me and Paul with 2 employees in a 1,300 square foot space, which you probably have some recollection of at some point back in the 80s. But anyways, we did not write a vision, but we had one in our heads. And a vision is really, I would say, in the context of our current conversation and the current understanding of the world, it's just the story of your life in the future told as if it already happened. So many of us are spending our lives, and I would certainly have been doing the same had I not learned this many years ago. We're reacting to current problems and opportunities. So if we're in business, I was just speaking to a group of restaurant people, somebody calls you and they go, man, we're going to give you this great deal. We're going to finance the whole build out of your new place. Or tomorrow, whatever, the city digs up the street in front of your place and your foot traffic drops by half. So these are all situations that we want to respond to. But when we don't have a clear story in our head of what we're trying to create, it's very difficult to make effective decisions. So we had a vision in our head. The story that you're relating about Paul sitting me down was actually in 1993, so 11 years in. In hindsight, I would say now that we had finished the original story. I think, Gareth, in your book, it says you never know where a story will end, especially when you're in it. And that's true for us. So in a sense, that original story ended, but at the same time, it was really the beginning, of course, of the next story. And the next story began with Paul sitting me down on the bench out front of the deli about 10 o'clock on a nice summer day when it was warm out, and looking at me in the eye and saying, okay, in 10 years, what are we doing? Which in essence was, what's your vision? In essence, in the context of what you're asking now, is what story do we want to be telling about ourselves 10 years down the road? And I wrote the story of that in a pamphlet conveniently titled The Story of Visioning at Zingerman's, and we wrote one from there. So all of that answers your question in some way.
It certainly does. Now, when you scrape away what stories are, it comes down to context, which is rooted in a topic that the both of you address, and you do a workshop on it, and it's called belief. So, Gareth, what do you mean by belief, and how does that shape us? So, I'm losing your audio. Sorry.
The longer version of that story, you got that? Yeah. Are you hearing me now? So what's really good is I was believing a story that if I pressed the mute button on my microphone and forgot to unmute it, that suddenly you'd be able to hear me anyway. So there you go. I have a story that I'm more technologically adept than I am. So
yeah. Well, that's the eternal hope of the Irish, is it not? Things
well,
will
it
work
is
out.
there, and there are some people I know who would really like to have a mute button for me. So anyway, the longer title for that workshop was Beliefs About Stories and Stories About Beliefs, and it was something that came through brainstorming. I think it was really Ari who proposed it, and I love the idea that you can step back and like almost hold up your stories and your beliefs to the light. And I'll quote something that Ari said. This is 3 months ago now at this workshop, 2 months ago. That honestly, I've been thinking about 2 or 3 times a week since he said it. One of the things that's unusual about Ari is Ari's a very well-known person, and his personal email address is publicly available, and he gives it out at when he's speaking, and you can find it on the website. And I was quite surprised the first time I saw that, because I don't give my personal email address out, and I'm not very well known at all. I already get more email than I want. And so what I heard Ari say was that he gives his email address out because he doesn't have negative beliefs about email. And there were other reasons too. And I thought, that's amazing. I realized my negative experience of email is connected to the negative beliefs that I hold about email. And that if I started to change my belief into, instead of, oh, I'm being bombarded with all this stuff, into, oh, this is just a contemporary version of sitting around a campfire, having the opportunity to hear from other people who want to be in touch with me for some reason, and maybe I can help them. And frankly, more often than not, they help me. And yes, there is red tape, and there are emails that do feel like a bombardment, but they actually are the exception to the rule. If you start shifting your belief to, maybe email's a beautiful thing. And so as I've started to do that, I've wondered about how else that would affect other things in my life. Where do I hold negative beliefs that may not be true? Now, finally, on this point, there are things that it is useful to have negative beliefs about. It is useful to believe that if you stand too close to the edge of a cliff, you're in danger. That is a useful negative belief. But maybe a good number, if not most, of the things I hold negative beliefs about may not be negative at all. And it may be that the belief is causing the negative experience.
Good, sure. Now, Ari, you want to jump in because I want to pick up on that with this negative beliefs that you are believing. So what's your take on that topic that he was talking about? So.
Well, about email, it's true.
No, not necessarily about email.
I was thinking, Gareth. It's maybe instead of the campfire, it's a little thinking to Ireland. It's a little like going into the pub. Like you're going to see a lot of people. Some of them you have zero interest in talking to, but there's no way to go to the pub and see your best friend and have a pint unless you go in there. And so when you go in there, it's inevitable that there'll be a plethora of people there. Some you don't want to talk to, some you do, and some you never even knew were existent in the world, but you might meet somebody great. And anyways, I would reframe the belief about the cliff to be a positive belief, which is that staying further from the cliff's edge allows you to live the life that you want to lead. So I don't think it's really a negative belief about the cliff. It's just understanding, to your earlier point, is it true? So if you were to believe that you could step off the cliff and not fall, that would be fallacious and unhelpful. So John, my work in this area really was all around beliefs. As both of you already know, I ended up writing a giant book about it. But until I started the work on that, which is probably almost 10 years ago now, I honestly had never thought about beliefs. I mean, and when I talk beliefs here, I'm not talking religion, sports, and politics, although those are also beliefs, but they're three commonly used areas. I'm thinking more about beliefs about everything from email to beliefs about people, what human nature is like, beliefs about food, meals, work, our significant others, our parents, our families, etc. I was just on a call where one of the people was saying, well, these young people between 25 and 30, they just have such a terrible work ethic. The whole book that I wrote is based around a self-fulfilling belief cycle. And I'm like, well, if you enter the relationship with the belief that everyone between 25 and 30 is somehow lazy, it's not going to go well. I mean, because your energy will be bad. You'll be much shorter of temper with them. You will be unlikely to give them challenging assignments, et cetera, et cetera. They then in turn start to believe that you don't like them, or that all work is terrible, or that they have no future in your organization. And then they do mediocre work, because who would do great work if you feel like you're not treated with dignity, you don't matter, and there's no future? Like, nobody's going to do great work like that. And it's just self-fulfilling. So my work originally was all around understanding beliefs. And as Gareth alluded, I started to look at beliefs as the root system of our lives. We don't see them, but everything that comes up above the surface is always based on our beliefs.
I want to drill down on that, because as belief relates to stories, and this is particularly for you, Gareth, and Ari won't pick it up in a minute, but you grew up in a sectarian society where each side, Catholics and Protestants, had their own belief system, apart just from religion per se, but Catholics do this, Protestants that, back and forth, and an ugly situation. So in your peacemaking activities, how can storytelling strip away some of those, I don't know if you would call them beliefs, but negative thoughts we have about the other? What is your
Sure.
experience with that?
Well,
Gareth?
there's a lovely thing if people have seen the TV show Dairy Girls, which I'm pretty sure is on Netflix. It's a really funny satirical show about the north of Ireland, and it has a good episode where they talk about kind of the stories that each side in our community in the north of Ireland, the prejudices and the stories we had about each other. What are Catholics like? What are Protestants like? And so, one of the stories they were working with in that show was sometimes it's helpful to laugh at our stories, not take them too seriously. But sometimes we really do need to have a serious dialogue. And the best form of dialogue, in my experience, is one in which I get to listen to your story until I have understood it enough for you to tell me, yes, I think you get me now. And for you to listen to my story until you've understood it enough to the point where I can say to you, yes, I think you get me now. Not do we agree with each other, but do we understand each other? And all things are possible once people are prepared to listen to each other's stories. Charles Eisenstein, the philosopher, has this lovely phrase saying, the most important question that we can be asking anybody these days is, what is it like to be you? And to really listen to that story. What is it like to be you? Mira Nair, the Indian American filmmaker, said to me once that the best kind of movies that we could be watching are ones that help us see life through the eyes of the other. I have learned so much about parts of the world that I've never visited through watching movies or reading books that were set in those places. And it's not rocket science, but if we can create environments in which each of us has the chance to be heard and understood, all things are possible. And the truth is, someone always needs to go first. There always needs to be someone who has enough grounding and stability within themselves to be the first to say, I'm going to listen to you. I'm going to put aside my prejudices. I'm going to put aside my insistence on getting it my way. Now, if there's actual physical danger or a real risk in the room, we need to take steps to protect people. First of all, I always try to say, I want to work for a world in which there's a table big enough to accommodate everybody, and the only rule for sitting at that table is a commitment to not harm anybody else. And if you can't make that commitment, then you can't sit at the table. You can sit outside the room, and we will. Some of us will go out and have a chat with you from time to time. Make sure you have enough food and enough shelter, but you can't come into the room until you've agreed to not harm anybody. And some of us take longer to get there than others, but someone always has to go first.
That's a powerful thought, and I think Ari, throughout to your 40 plus years of business building and creating a community of businesses, which are beyond the deli, the restaurants and the coffee shop and bakery and all of those kinds of things. Everyone that you have worked with or has worked in the community, it's not all. I mean, everybody. You have strong ethos and value systems, but there are often disagreements. So how does storytelling or belief system, how do you persuade? What begins to pick up things that Gareth was talking about seeing others and saying, I understand?
Well, I mean, there's many pieces of that. One thing I learned from the belief study work is that you can't make anyone change their beliefs. And in fact, as the history of the north of Ireland demonstrates quite well, until people are ready to let their beliefs be changed, they can persistently prove that their beliefs are in their mind correct and the, in quotes, other side's beliefs are false. I guess I would just say, in my experience here, introducing the idea of beliefs, the fact that they're not genetic, the fact that they may or may not be helpful, to Gareth's earlier point, the fact that they may or not be true, at least opens a door to conversation that allows me or anyone else to hear the other person in a different way. and it allows me to say what I want to say in a different way. So I would, I'll share that whatever it's been 5-6 years now of actively talking and working on the belief stuff within our organization. The phrase "I think X" is said far less frequently than it used to be, and it's been replaced pretty regularly, not all the time, but pretty regularly with, well, what I believe is, or my belief is. And I'll just say from experience, and I don't know exactly why, but when someone says, my belief is this, or in Gareth's world, they might say the story I'm telling myself is this. They're allowing that it may be wrong. They're allowing that you could have a different one. Whereas how I grew up was in the argument of thinking. And so if I say, just blurt out my version of the facts, which I can still slip into doing, it's how I grew up. It generally just provokes an equal and opposite reaction, which then ends up in the verbal version of the North of Ireland's history and doesn't really go anywhere. If I can back up and say, my belief is this, my fears are this, my anxiety is this, the story I hear you telling is this, the story I'm telling myself is this, they all allow for a lot more space in the room. And I'm not here to suggest I've mastered doing this. I can slip like anybody, but at least I think here I gleaned a lot of understanding, in great part from reading Gareth's book, helped me to understand that stories and beliefs were essentially two sides of the same thing. And I started to say what I still say, which is stories are beliefs made manifest. And so when we tell a story, there's beliefs embedded in it. If we change the belief, we change the story. If we change the story, we change the belief. And so Gareth's book does a great job of explaining that.
Great. And Gareth, one of your books, I think your newest book, is the Seventh Story. And a quote from it, which I love and gets to the heart, I think, of what we're speaking about now is, quote, "A new story, a new way of life in which love, not violence, is the protagonist." And obviously I can see how that would apply to the North of Ireland, but also in any community of business. There isn't violence, let's hope, but there's sharp disagreement that leads to conflict and essentially it could be dissolution, but certainly lack of productivity. So where did you come up with the idea of love as an engine of storytelling?
Well, I didn't come up with that, but and I co-authored that book with Brian McLaren, and when we talk about love, I don't mean a greeting card version of love, and I also don't mean what Leonard Cohen beautifully puts in Hallelujah. He says, "Love is not a victory march." We're not here to defeat each other or to conquer. My favorite definition of love basically says love is extending yourself for the sake of the good. And the good cannot be bad for you, right? So there's a kind of, some people talk about some others as being really very loving when actually they're talking about people who are very self-sacrificing and who end up harming themselves by how they give away more than they can, right? Because you've got to make sure that your needs are taken care of, and that can only happen in the context of community, where I share with my community, these are my gifts I'm going to share from this place, and these are my needs. I need you to help me meet these needs. So to me, love is a far stronger, more courageous, more creative. Sometimes love is angry. Love is angry at the suffering happening to other people. Sometimes love is the thing that says, no, I will not let you do that. Sometimes love is the thing that pushes me to pay a price, actually, for the sake of others. And a lot of the time, love is just lovely, right? There's a reason we call it love. My sense is that we're not here as individuals supposed to be competing with each other. We are here to collaborate and create with each other in this big play called life. And at the end of our lives, the best thing that we could have would be to look back and say, I loved more people and I received love from more people, rather than I've accumulated all this stuff, and certainly I rather than I defeated all these people along the way. One piece that's important to say just underneath this is that beliefs and stories about love are just as important or no more important than beliefs and stories we have about our needs, right? So what I think underlies our beliefs and our stories is our needs. We have beliefs about the needs that we have. The problem is our stories often don't align with those needs. The primary need is for security and belonging. And a lot of people think that the way to get security and belonging is to hurt other people. It would be better to ask, is that belief, is that story really true? Is it really helpful? How can we, I'm not saying get rid of your need for belonging and security. I'm suggesting there may be better ways to get those needs met.
Great thought. And picking up on that, Ari, I want to take it in a little bit different direction, because when we use the word love as described it, what Gareth says, and we talk about storytelling and we talk about belief, it all sounds very good. But if things don't come our way or we see disappointments, we can become frustrated and maybe even cynical. So, in the long years you have run the business or interacted with folks from so many different sections around the world, what is our guard against cynicism?
Well, I grew up knowing how to be as cynical and sarcastic as the best of them. What I would say now, John, is that cynicism is just another word for negative beliefs. It's also a way to hold low hope and defend yourself in the world. So in part 1 of the Zingerman's Guide to Good Leading series, so the beliefs book is part 4, but in part 1, there's an essay called 12 Natural Laws of Business. I just writing a piece about natural law number 8 for tomorrow's e-news. But the natural laws of business are just, it's what we all do to get to greatness. You can call them business, nonprofit, personal, doesn't matter. There's another list of 12 that's not in that book. And one of them is you can't get positive outcomes from negative beliefs. It's just impossible. That doesn't mean there's no problems. It's just you could have positive beliefs about a problem, like this is a tragic situation. There's a lot of anger and a lot of frustration and fear. But if we work together collaboratively, we can untangle all of that and create a positive outcome. Like that would be acknowledging, in Gareth's context, the truth of the difficulty of the difficult story of the past, but also holding a positive belief about what we can collaboratively, peacefully create together. Cynicism, I would suggest, is a series of negative beliefs. It's a defense mechanism, but it can't ever create anything healthy and helpful. And so my way of dealing with it, to answer your question directly, is I just decided, I don't know how many years ago in doing this work, I'm not going to hold negative beliefs. And when I find them, which I have them, it's like weeding the garden. They pop up. But if you pick them early, it's pretty easy. If you let the weed grow for 30 or 40 or 50 years, it's very difficult to get it out. So when I catch myself, and I can slip into sarcasm too, I try to just pull the weed and stop.
Well, I love that metaphor, or that text of negative cynicism or negative thoughts being weeds. We can get our hands around it. Well, I would say an antidote to weeds is a theme of our show, which is grace. And as you know, Ari, because you are a returning guest to the show, and Gareth is a newcomer. So is there a story about grace that you would like to share? And I invite Gareth, you want to go first?
Sure. It's a simple story. But, over 20 years ago, I borrowed some money from my dad. And when it came time for me to pay him back, not only could I not pay him back, I needed to ask to borrow more money. And I was nervous. And I remember going to the house and telling this to Dad. And Dad actually, tears came to his eyes. And he said, I don't have any more money. And he meant literally he didn't have any money in the bank. It was, maybe 10 days before he was going to get paid. And this was a huge moment for me of realizing it was one of those moments that often happens with your parents. You realize they're not invincible, and he was speaking to me from a place of compassion. But then he said that my bike that I had loaned him about 2 years previously, which I never used, which was not a very expensive bike by any means. He said that even though he couldn't loan me any more money, he would offer to buy my bike from me for the amount that I owed him, which was far, far more than the bike was worth. And that to me is, it may seem like a small mundane story, but I think that is an epitome of grace. When you haven't earned and you can't actually work for it, but someone who has more power than you in the moment just gives you a freely given gift that ends up being worth far more than the dollar amount, that it releases you from pain or burden that you've put on yourself. And here I am telling the story over 20 years later, and I have a deep smile on my face, and I want to continue to offer that kind of grace to other people, and I'm grateful to my dad for doing it. John has been left speechless by my story. And so.
Oh, well, like you, I forgot to put myself back in the picture. So, Ari, is there a story about grace or a comment that you would like to add about?
Well, first of all, thank you for writing that book. And you're welcome to put the essay I wrote about your work into the show notes or whatever, if that's of help, John. I knew you were going to ask, and I was thinking about it this morning. I don't know if it's a good one, but it's the one that I'm going to land on because it's what came to my mind first. And it's a difficult story, far more charged in the world's sense, really, than Gareth's lovely story about his dad. But it's from last spring. We had a woman who much loved, had been a partner here in the organization for many years. It's been, I've lost track, about 15 since she left. So it's not like she was in our ecosystem every day, but still, had many either direct ongoing relationships with people who have worked here for a long time, and certainly spiritually and I don't know, values wise was a big part of our organization. And she was tragically killed in her home. And I guess the reason it made me think of grace is just the grace with which the organization, which means the people in it, because the organization is only the people, dealt with it, was really amazing. And it's I realize in hindsight, like, it's this multi-layered thing. And so it's sort of, there's the people who knew her, and many of whom, a fair few of us who worked with her for 15 years before she moved on. So there's that. Then there's people like me who knew her, liked her a lot, worked with her regularly for 15 years, haven't really talked to her a lot since she left. We get along fine. It's just not somebody who's in my immediate friendship circle, but there's still the implications of grief and loss and that go with it. And then there's the people who have stayed good friends with her and the tragic impact of that. And then there's people within the organization who, well over half of whom started in the last 3 or 4 years, who never met her, and many of whom never even heard of her, but they're impacted by the grief of the people they work with who did know her. And so I started to imagine it's a little bit like if you're, in Gareth's story, one of your parents' best friends or good friends dies. You met them 3-4 times, they exist, but it's really no big impact on yourself directly. But because your parents are very tragically impacted, that impacts you. So I guess in hindsight, just, it's still a horrible story, but the grace with which everybody allowed each other space to grieve and to find a way through that grief in their own way, and to honor each other and to treat each other with dignity through the whole thing, to me, sums it up.
That's thank you for sharing that. And I do know the story of woman, and the grief that you show to others is an example of the love. That's why there's the grief, because it's a loss of a loved one. So, gentlemen, thank you both. Gareth, you're a wonderful storyteller, and Ari, you are a storyteller, builder, both of you, building for peace and building for a better world. And it's an honor to know you both. And I will put the notes, your respective websites and books, so people can find you. So it's my honor to have spoken to you both today, and I say thank you. So,
Thank you,
Thank
John.
you so much.
Don't forget to put my email in there.